July 2025, a U.S. Army launcher vehicle, part of the 1st Multi-Domain Task Force, rolled off a C-17 at RAAF Base Darwin, Northern Territory, Australia. The flatbed moved slowly down the ramp under Australian Defence Force security personnel and U.S. Army handlers who had done this kind of transfer dozens of times in garrison, but never on foreign soil, never under these conditions. The system on that flatbed was a long-range hypersonic weapon battery, the Dark Eagle, range, over 1,700 miles. Time to target, under 30 minutes, anywhere inside that circle. And that circle, drawn from Darwin, reaches Hainan Island. The move did not make the front page. The Pentagon did not hold a press conference. But PLA satellites watched the offload. They were supposed to. The MH-60 Seahawks lifting off Darwin's runway are not the headline. The headline is the radar scope humming inside the E-2D Hawkeye banking overhead. The eye that sees first, the signal that tells every capital in the region who controls the frequency and whose airspace this now is. The question the move raises is not, can Dark Eagle hit a target? The system's range and speed are public. The question is, why deploy it here, why now, and why let Beijing watch? Because if the goal were simply capability, the launcher stays in garrison at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and the range math does not change. The Pentagon moved steel to make a point, and the point was not aimed at Australia. To understand what Darwin just became, watch the E-2D Hawkeye climbing off the carrier's angled flight deck and trace the cone of radar coverage it paints across the Western Pacific, a geometry the United States has been redrawing, ship by ship and airframe by airframe, for the better part of a decade. Start with the map. The first island chain runs from Japan through the AUKUS, Taiwan, the Philippines, and down to Borneo. It is not a political boundary, it is a geometric one. Every major Chinese naval and missile base sits inside it or behind it. The PLA Rocket Force's DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, with a range of roughly 2,500 miles, covers everything from Guam to the Andaman Sea. Guam sits at approximately 1,800 miles from the Chinese coast. That gap, between cheap short-range missiles and the expensive long-range ones, is where U.S. basing strategy has lived for years. The problem with that strategy is that it is legible. China has spent 2 decades reading it. The DF-26 was specifically designed and publicly labeled an aircraft carrier killer, and Guam Express by Chinese state media. It exists because Guam exists. The second island chain anchor is also the target list. So here is the strategic dead end the Pentagon has been working around. You cannot deter a missile threat from a fixed base that the missile was designed to destroy. The base is the problem. The base is also the only answer available, until recently. Most analysts focused on the wrong thing when discussing Dark Eagle deployment options. They asked about range to China from the second island chain. That was the wrong question. The real constraint was never range. It was survivability and political geometry. If you want the strategy behind the headline instead of the headline, this is the channel. Subscribe now, and we will keep breaking the map down. What the Pentagon needed was not just a launcher that could reach the Chinese mainland. It needed a launcher on ground it could defend, on soil where the political cost of stationing it was acceptable, and from a position that China could not easily target without triggering a response that Beijing does not want. That calculation pointed south, not west, and it pointed there long before the Dark Eagle battery landed at Darwin. Pull up the radar scope. The E-2D's coverage radius, the F-35B's combat radius out of Darwin, the Ohio-class submarine's patrol envelope beneath the Pacific horizon. Stack those rings and the argument makes itself. Darwin sits at approximately 14 degrees south latitude, 130 degrees east longitude. The Hainan Island Naval Base, home of the PLA South Sea Fleet and China's ballistic missile submarine force, sits at roughly 20 degrees north, 110 degrees east, direct distance approximately 2,700 miles. That is outside the current stated range of the Dark Eagle configuration, which is publicly assessed at over 1,700 miles. The immediate counterpoint is obvious. From Darwin, the system does not reach Hainan directly, but that is not the geometry that matters. The geometry that matters is the Luzon Strait and the Bashi Channel. The Luzon Strait is the body of water between Taiwan and the northern Philippines. It is roughly 230 miles wide. Through it passes the primary deepwater access route from the South China Sea to the Philippine Sea and the wider Pacific. Any Chinese naval force moving east from Hainan or Zhejiang toward open ocean must transit through or around this choke point. The Bashi Channel, the southern portion of the Luzon Strait between Taiwan and Luzon, narrows to under 150 miles. From Darwin, the Dark Eagle's range fan overlaps the Luzon Strait directly. Transit corridors for PLA Navy surface groups. The sea lanes through which Chinese resupply and reinforcement would move in any Taiwan contingency. All of these fall inside the engagement envelope of a battery currently parked on Australian soil. That is the range circle Beijing's generals are staring at. Not a direct strike on the Chinese mainland. A conventional hypersonic system that can hold the transit routes at risk, from a position that is not on the first island chain, not on Guam, and not on a ship they can track. One detail that stuck with me when I went through the deployment sequencing: the timing inside Talisman Sabre was not incidental. Talisman Sabre is the largest bilateral military exercise between the United States and Australia, conducted every 2 years. In its 2025 iteration, it included over 30,000 personnel from 9 nations, operating across a footprint that spanned from the Coral Sea to the Timor Sea, rehearsing exactly the kind of distributed maritime and land-based operations the Pentagon has been wargaming for a Taiwan contingency. The exercise provides legal and logistical cover for exactly the kind of equipment movement that would otherwise require lengthy diplomatic negotiation. Roll a hypersonic launcher off a transport during a major Allied exercise, and it is a training deployment. Roll the same launcher off the same transport on a random Tuesday, and it is a strategic statement requiring a formal response. The Pentagon chose the exercise window deliberately. That was not sloppy coordination. That was the message layered inside the message. Here's the part the map does not show yet. The second-order signal from the Darwin deployment is not about what Dark Eagle can hit. It is about what Australia has agreed to become. That shift is more consequential than any single missile battery. Under the AUKUS framework signed in September 2021 between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the public conversation has centered on nuclear-powered submarines. The Virginia-class rotational deployments to HMS Sterling near Perth, the buildup of submarine maintenance infrastructure, the long-term SSN AUKUS program. That is the visible AUKUS story. The invisible AUKUS story is what is happening at Darwin, at Tyndall, and at the RAAF bases being quietly upgraded across northern Australia. Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement facilities, pre-positioned munitions, rotational bomber presence at Tyndall that already includes B-52 Stratofortress deployments. The groundwork for a distributed basing architecture that does not rely on any single hub China can target with a DF-26 barrage. What this deployment shows is an inflection point that neither government announced. Australia is no longer just a logistics hub or training partner in U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. It is a strike node. A forward-deployed conventional hypersonic battery on Australian soil changes the conversation from access and transit rights to active deterrence participation. Canberra made that choice quietly. Beijing noticed loudly, in classified assessments rather than public statements. The internal debate inside the Albanese government over this decision was not trivial. Senior ministers understood that accepting the battery created a category shift in Australia's strategic posture, one that previous governments had consistently avoided by drawing a distinction between hosting U.S. forces for exercises and hosting U.S. strike systems in a forward-deployed configuration. That distinction is now gone. The officials who pushed hardest for the deployment argued that the economic coercion Beijing had already applied demonstrated that strategic ambiguity was not protecting Australia. The officials who hesitated pointed to the same history and reached the opposite conclusion. The deployment happened, which tells you who won that argument, but the margin was not comfortable. Every Type 052D destroyer plot that appears on that radar scope now has to account for a second problem it did not have before: an F-35B lifting vertically off a deck it cannot locate, at a range it cannot close. The Pentagon moved the piece Beijing has to find the board. Option 1 for China: target the Dark Eagle battery in a contingency. But the battery is on Australian territory. Any PLA strike on Australian soil triggers ANZUS mutual defense obligations, immediately widens the conflict beyond Taiwan, and confronts China with a two-front geography it cannot manage. The political cost of attacking a Darwin battery is the coalition, not just one launcher. Option 2. Develop the capability to hold Darwin at risk with existing systems. The DF-26 has the range, but here is the asymmetry. The DF-26's primary guidance systems and its conventional warhead variant have a circular error probable significantly larger than the system's nuclear variant. Targeting a mobile ground launcher with a ballistic missile requires precise locating data that degrades quickly against a road mobile system. The Dark Eagle battery can move. The DF-26 battery, once located and targeted, is a fixed problem for US ISR assets. A road mobile ground system on Allied soil is a harder problem for China than a carrier it can track across the Philippine Sea. A carrier shows up on satellite imagery every pass. A launcher convoy in the Northern Territory can be anywhere inside a radius the PLA does not have enough ISR coverage to saturate. Option 3. Demand Australia reverse the deployment through diplomatic pressure. Beijing has tried this before, with Australian coal, with wine, with barley. The economic coercion campaign against Australia that began in 2020 produced the opposite of the intended effect. It hardened Australian strategic alignment with Washington at precisely the moment Canberra was weighing the cost of deeper defense commitments. The coercion argument has already been made, and the Australian answer is parked at RAAF Darwin. Here is the take that may be contested. The Dark Eagle deployment to Darwin matters more for the alliance signal than for the kinetic capability. A single battery does not rebalance the Pacific. What it does is establish a precedent. Australia has accepted a U.S. forward strike capability on its soil. That precedent is harder to walk back than any particular launcher, and it licenses what follows: pre-position munitions, rotational bomber upgrades, future hypersonic variants with greater range, potentially even forward-deployed submarine maintenance for Virginia-class boats already rotating through Perth. The battery is the foot in the door. Beijing strategists know it. What would you do in Beijing's position right now? You have watched the U.S. systematically move the chess pieces off the first island chain, distribute them across a geography you cannot cover, and anchor them in alliances you cannot break. Comment below. Is China's strategic window in the Western Pacific closing faster than most analysts assumed 2 years ago? The obstacle the Pentagon faced in developing this posture was not the weapon itself. The Dark Eagle program hit significant development delays. The Army's hypersonic program was restructured at least twice before reaching operational readiness assessment in 2024, facing propulsion integration challenges and test failures that pushed initial fielding timelines by roughly 2 years. The deployment to Darwin represents the first operational context-forward deployment of the system, not the first use of a mature, proven capability. Beijing's analysts will be calculating the readiness margin between deployable for training and deployable for conflict. That gap has not closed yet. And the range fan from Darwin does not just reach the Luzon Strait. Overlaid on a strategic map, a 1,700-mile arc from Darwin's coordinates also reaches deep into the South China Sea, covering the artificial island bases China has constructed at Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef in the Spratly Archipelago. Those installations, built against explicit international arbitration rulings and equipped with runways, missile batteries, and radar systems, have been described by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command as significant military facilities. They now sit inside the same engagement envelope as the Luzon transit corridors. The geometry is not subtle. China's South China Sea forward basing posture, built over a decade at enormous political and financial cost, has acquired a new complicating variable, a conventional prompt strike capability that does not require overflight of Chinese territory, does not require carrier positioning in a contested sea, and does not rest on a fixed platform that can be pre-targeted in the opening hours of a conflict. The board favors the distributed architecture today, but several things remain unresolved. The Philippines is still negotiating the precise terms of AUKUS site development at Cagayan de Isabela and the sites facing the Luzon Strait directly. The U.S. basing geometry in the first island chain remains dependent on Manila's political stability and the outcome of electoral cycles that Washington cannot control. The access is not guaranteed. The infrastructure is being built on borrowed time and optimistic political assumptions. Second unresolved variable, the Dark Eagle's reload capacity and magazine depth in a sustained conflict remain classified. A single battery with a finite number of rounds is a deterrent signal. Whether it constitutes a genuine warfighting capability against a PLA salvo that opens with hundreds of ballistic missiles depends on logistical chains from CONUS that have not been stress-tested in a real contingency. The tyranny of distance that has always complicated U.S. power projection in the Pacific does not disappear because the launcher moves south. It shifts the geometry, but does not erase the supply problem. Ammunition, maintenance crews, replacement components, and the airlift capacity to sustain a forward-deployed hypersonic battery through the opening weeks of a high-intensity conflict represent a logistics chain that runs from Redstone Arsenal in Alabama to the Northern Territory of Australia. That chain has never been exercised under wartime conditions. Third, Japan's posture. Tokyo has announced a significant expansion of its defense capabilities and strike depth, including acquisition of Tomahawk cruise missiles and development of domestically produced long-range strike options. Japan's decision about whether to host U.S. hypersonic assets on Japanese soil or to develop an analogous Japanese system will do more to close the deterrence geometry in the Northern Pacific than any number of Darwin deployments. That conversation is ongoing, deliberately ambiguous, and not yet resolved. What the Talisman Sabre deployment demonstrated is that the United States has stopped waiting for that conversation to conclude before moving the pieces. The launcher is already in the Southern Hemisphere. The precedent is already set. AUKUS has quietly shifted from a submarine program to a strike architecture, and the announcement was a flatbed truck rolling off a C-17 at RAAF Darwin, while the cameras were pointed at a fleet of warships offshore. The carrier, in this case, was never the message. The map was. And the map, drawn from Darwin with a 1,700-mile compass, reads only one way from Beijing's operations centers. Power projection, at its most effective, is not what you can destroy. It is where you can stand without being moved, and where your adversary's options for moving you carry costs they are not prepared to pay. Australia is where that geometry converges. On the flight deck of a carrier steaming through the Pacific, the watch officer tracks contacts that now stretch from the South China Sea to the northern Australian coastline, and the arc of coverage looks nothing like it did in 2024.